As we continue our study in the book of Ephesians, in chapter 6, we see that Paul continues his look at different relationships that we have with each other. And we did a good bit of study on the husband-wife relationship as Dylan taught us those lessons, and he did a very good job there. And this morning we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit from the end of chapter 5 going into chapter 6 and look at the relationship between parents and children. And so I foresee us pretty well dealing with that this morning. I don't think we'll get out of those verses. So this morning primarily we will be dealing with the parent-child relationship as taught by Paul here in Ephesians chapter 6. So to kind of set the stage for that, I'd like to read the first 4 verses of Ephesians chapter 6, and then we'll get into our study there. It says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you, and you may live long on the earth. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." And so here we have these first 4 verses dealing with that parent-child relationship. And of course, he begins by telling the children to obey your parents in the Lord. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And as we said in the previous lesson, we learned that the submission of both husband and wife is essential for a proper relationship or a successful relationship, and therefore a successful marriage. And then, it kind of builds upon what Paul said in verse 21 of chapter 5, where he, in that passage it says, submitting to one another in the fear of God. And so any Christian relationship, Christian to Christian, whether it be husband, wife, whether it be, our brothers and sisters in Christ, there is a certain amount of submission that we have towards each other. We submit to each other. And so in the husband-wife relationship, as we saw, you have different forms of submission. Now, those things look different. You have different roles in that relationship, but both are submissive to each other in different ways. You and I, as brothers and sisters in Christ, we have a certain amount of submission that we have that is required between us and in our relationship. And so as we move forward in this chapter, looking at the parent-child relationship, you have submission in that relationship as well. Now, oftentimes we look at this relationship and that submission sometimes is one-sided in our minds. We think about the children being submissive to the parents, but in a certain regard or in a certain way, we as parents are submissive to our children because we have obligations, we have things that we need to consider in our relationship to them, and so therefore we are in a certain way submissive to our children in this relationship as well. So this is essential. Children are commanded to obey their parents. And this is very clear as we look in the first verse of Ephesians chapter 6. But it also will become clear as we study that we as parents, and in this chapter, fathers in particular, have to consider our children as well as we look at our relationship with our children. So as we get into our study here, this very first part of verse 1, I've got it highlighted there on the screen. Children, obey your parents. And so, the author of our book says that this is the only command in the Bible given specifically to children. I would have to say that I can't think of another one. I didn't do just a ton of research on that. One of you may have something else that you might like to bring up where children are specifically commanded to do something, but it's the only one I can think of. And so this specific command here seems to be the only command that's specifically given to children that we have in the Bible. The Greek word for children, I'm not really going to try to pronounce that, is tekna. I'm assuming tekna. It's not just limited to infants. It's not just, these toddlers, these younger children, as we sometimes might think of it. It's a broad term which includes all offspring still under the care and responsibility of parents. And so this is a more broader term. We're not talking about, Sometimes when we see small kids, we refer to them as children, and then once they get on up, you got your preteens and your teens, things of that nature. And so sometimes in our minds, especially in our children's minds, or maybe our minds when we were younger, we feel like this verse maybe is speaking to people 12 and under. But that's not really the idea that we get in the context and in the definition of the word. It's just children under the care of their parents. And so this would extend, in my thinking, a little older than that adolescence, preteen sort of age there. Some children to believe that once they get too large to spank, so to speak, and of course we've got probably different opinions on when exactly that is, but they feel like that once they get too old to spank, then they no longer have to abide by this passage here, and I don't believe that's the case at all. This is not the spirit in which this passage is written. Until that time when a child is able to leave the house, to able to start his own family, then if he's still under the care of his parents, if he's still under the roof of his parents, then therefore these passages come into play there. Does anyone have any comments or anything, any different way that they see that than what I've spoken this morning?
Shane, maybe just a little bit different, but really not. As we get older, of course, if we're fortunate that our parents are still alive, I think that could extend on to older children, just out of respect.
Yeah, and we will definitely, as we get into verse 2, I think that's where verse 2 comes into play. And so as we get into verse 2, I think that kind of deals with the broader relationship that we have as we get older into adulthood. So I do think we still have an obligation and to that relationship, and we'll try to point that out as we get into verse 2. But specifically, this verse 1. Does anyone have any comments on that? All right, to obey here literally means here under authority. This passage suggests habitual and constant submission. And so this is a habitual, it's a constant submission. It's doing exactly what our parents would like for us to do during this time of our life. You look at Colossians chapter 3 and verse 20, it says, "Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord." And so here again, you have this reiteration of what we said here, this command to obey your parents. And so this is well-pleasing to the Lord. In order for us to be pleasing to God as children, the children must obey their parents. And as all of us know, those of us who are parents, and I mean, all of us were a part of a family at one time, and as I think we've got all adults in here, we probably have matured enough to understand that obedient children are a major factor in creating a home that is filled with joy and peace. And as children, we may not see it that way. We may see our parents' attitude or what they're, a lot of times we think that they're being too strict or things like that. But as we mature, most of the time we come to understand what our parents were trying to accomplish. And so I think most of us in here would agree with this statement that obedient children are a major factor. Now, they're not the only major factor, because the mother and father play a huge role in that, and they can do a lot to create chaos in the home as well. But the children are a part of that. And so, most children prefer peace with their parents. They prefer joy in the home. And so children need to realize that their attitude, their submission to their parents goes a long way in making these things happen. We also see that God has always required a child to obey the parent. This was definitely the case under the Mosaic law, where disobedient children were punished with the death sentence. And so God was very strict about that under the Mosaic law. We can read there in Deuteronomy chapter 21. We won't take the time to do that, but we can see that it was necessary under the Mosaic law for children to obey their parents, and if they refused to do so, then that was punishable by death. And so for us today, that seems a little extreme, but God takes it seriously. God takes this seriously for children to be under the submission of their parents. And so we need to, I guess, as we are raising children, to make sure they understand how serious God takes that, and how serious He has always taken that. But yet, even under the new law, parental disobedience is also considered a very grave matter. And I want to take a minute to turn over to Romans chapter 1 and read verses 28 through 32. And of course, disobedience to parents is just a small part of this passage, but I think it would be good for us to read this passage in its entirety to kind of see how it's categorized. You know, all these other things that are listed here, and then you have disobedience to parents in amongst these things, and so you can see the seriousness of it. And so there in Romans chapter 1, beginning with verse 28, it says, "And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, to those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them." And so we see basically right in the middle of all of these things which we would consider to be very grievous sins, you have this sin of being disobedient to parents. And so it's a very serious thing. And God has always required this. He continues to require this under the new law. And so we need to make sure that we instill in our children and our grandchildren and any child that we may happen to be in contact with, that this is a serious thing for them to disobey their parents. And it's not anything that they should take lightly. Any comments or anything along those lines? Yeah.
Served as priest, and he had sons that were doing abhorrent things.
Yeah.
And charge was made against him that he did not restrain them, some versions say.
Yeah.
So they had an obligation to obey, but the father had an obligation. These are grown adult men committing these acts, but the father still had a responsibility.
Yeah.
We shouldn't shirk our responsibility when that time comes.
Yeah, and we have a responsibility more so to our children, I think, than any other adult, and so and like you said, that's a good example there. And sometimes I know in my relationship with my adult children, they get to be an adult, and you kind of want to wash your hands and say, well, they're adults now. I just don't need to mess with them. But that's not the case. And so, while that relationship is different, there's still that bond there. And so that's a really good point. And, children, sometimes it's easier to deal with your small children than your adult children. And there's less heartache.
And there's responsibilities going in both directions there.
Yeah.
I think our times in society would opt for what you depicted as like, hey, they're grown.
Yeah.
You have a responsibility. I have a responsibility. And even them as adults, they have a responsibility to hear, as in heed, the parents' request.
Yeah, because that relationship, it's there, and it will always be there. And so, no matter how old. So that they have a special obligation to honor to listen. And therefore, like you said, it is a relationship that extends later into life. Yeah. Any other comments?
Yeah. Eli failed in 2 ways. He failed as a pharaoh, and he failed as a ruler. Eli had authority because of his position. He failed 2 ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think all these are very good points and very applicable. And that parent-child relationship. And as like I said, I'd like to study the adult portion of that when we get into verse 2 a little closer. But yet that relationship there is definitely a lifelong relationship. As we continue here in verse 1, when the child has a proper relationship with the parent, it prepares them for other relationships. When you learn obedience, discipline, reverence, awe, and respect for parents, that will be the key to making other relationships work. And so when you see a child that does not respect their parents, what you have the majority of the time is a child that doesn't respect authority in general. And that comes to, once they get into school, once they get out into the community with law enforcement and things of that nature, the government in general, and then ultimately God. And so this relationship that we begin instilling into our children at a very young age of you're obedient to this authority, your immediate authority, it prepares them ultimately to be obedient to God. And so the vast majority of the time, and there may be at some point that it works out or where you've got that relationship, but really you don't, because they're not obedient to their parents and they're told to respect. But if you've got a child that's not obedient to their parents, they're never going to be obedient to God, usually. I mean, they might change, but then that relationship's going to change with their parents, and you're going to have that honor later in life. And so there's that need to instill this into our children, so that it's not only the home that we're thinking about and that relationship and that peace that we have within the home. It's their ultimate soul that we have to consider. And so we must begin instilling obedience in our children. Therefore, that translates into submission and obedience to other authority and ultimately God. And so, since all human relationships are based upon what is learned as a child, one who obeys in the home will more likely or most likely obey the law of the land as well, and ultimately the law of God. But on the other hand, a disobedient child has not learned respect for authority, and they will cause chaos in society. And this could be just as simple as when we go to the grocery store, when we go to Walmart, and you see a disobedient child there that is just causing chaos in that store. I'm sure we've all experienced that, where this child is just being very disobedient, is maybe even taking it as far as being on the floor, just throwing a tantrum. And he's causing chaos where he can. And while that chaos might not extend very far there, as a child gets older, they're able to sow more and more chaos in different places. And so we see that this lack of obedience ultimately translates to chaos in our society. And so this is learned very early on in the child's life. And so we are helping them not only function properly within the home life, we are also helping them function properly in society as well. And so the family is the basis of our society, and it has been the basis of human society for centuries. Now, what we see now in the society that we live in, where people are trying to break down the family, and therefore we see society and a lot of other things being broken down as well. But if you have a society that focuses on the family, that that really follows God's plan in the family, then you're going to have a society that's going to be more pleasant, more adjusted, and more respect for others, and a better society to live in. And it's all part of God's divine wisdom. He understands human nature. He understands what we need. And so if we follow his plan, not only will our lives be better, but the lives of everyone around us will be better, and society as a whole. And that's just the wisdom in God's plan for man. Any comments along those lines?
Okay, going back to your couple points that you just made a few minutes ago, there is equality in the authority of the parents in this dynamic. The headship is hit on in chapter 5 that the husband is the head of his wife.
Mm-hmm.
So the father then is the head of his family. But a child has the obligation to submit to both equally. Children obey your parents, or when you mentioned Deuteronomy and in Romans, chapter 1, disobedient to the parents. Or so the parents, both the husband and the wife, the father and the mother, they have equal authority over the child. The child has responsibility not just to submit to the dad. The emphasis that you're going to get into is really placed on the father's role in teaching and admonishing his child, but they have equal authority over the child. So the child must equally submit to both the parents.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that out. Very good point. Any other comments? As we move on into verse 1, that next part says, in the Lord. So what we have here is in accordance with God's will. The basis of voluntary submission of man to man is in the fear of God. We see, the Ephesians 5:21 echoed here as well. It's kind of that same sentiment, in the Lord, according to God's will. So submission, which requires us to violate God's law, is not required and is actually forbidden. And so this becomes difficult for a child. Luckily, I don't think, maybe some in here have been put in a position where your parents' will was against God's will. But to the best of our ability as a child, we need to obey God rather than our parents. And of course, we've got to be secure in our understanding of God's law in order to be able to do that. And so this more or less, you would think would come into that later time in a child's life while they're still under the control of their parents, as they begin to be able to more understand God's law and how it directs their life there. We serve God, and in doing so, we will follow his standard. Only if we are commanded to do something which violates God's law should we refuse to obey any duly established authority. And so whether this is our parents, whether it's our boss, the government, no matter who it is, any duly established authority, basically the only reason we have to disobey that authority is if it violates God's law. When Peter and the other apostles were brought before the council and they were told to stop preaching Christ, they responded, we ought to obey God rather than man. And so at any time we ought to obey God. Daniel, when we look at him, he didn't allow the edicts of men to affect his fear of God. When he was ordered not to pray, he continued to do that anyway. I'd like to read verse 10 of Daniel chapter 6. It says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. And so here, of course, we all know the story of how Daniel was told that he could not pray to God anymore, that he could not seek any other higher powers other than the king there, but yet he just continued to do what he normally did. He just went home and went about his normal activities at that point. And so, one thing I want to see here or notice here, especially in reference to the parent-child relationship, is how that we see no blatant disrespect towards the authority that that these men were acting against. There was no disrespect towards them. There was just this simple statement that we're going to obey God rather than men. And we see them taking the consequences of that action. And so I think this is important when we, especially when we look at the parent-child relationship, in that we see things differently than our parents. And when it comes to these scriptures, or maybe our parents are just totally against the scriptures. But there's this disagreement there that does not give us license to disrespect them. We must still honor them in this disagreement. And with any authority, we must still honor that authority. So whether it's, again, our parents, whether it's our teachers, our bosses, the police, the governor, whoever it is, we still owe them that respect. And we see these men doing that in these particular situations. Oftentimes we see that putting God first may cause separation in family ties. And so, of course, this would probably be as the child gets older, into adulthood, this disagreement with your parents on spiritual matters often separates those family ties. Matthew 10 and verse 37 says, "He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." And so, oftentimes we struggle. We possess this great love and respect for our parents, and we crave that relationship that we would have with our parents if we give in maybe on spiritual matters. But yet we need to love God more than we love them. And even if that's going to sacrifice that relationship, and of course it would sacrifice, they would be deciding to sacrifice that relationship. But we know that's going to happen, and ultimately it does. We must stick to our guns and continue to obey God, because we must love God more than we love our parents or any other man. Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 27, it says, "Now great multitudes went with him, and he turned and he said to them, 'If anyone comes after me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, his own life also, he cannot be my disciples. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple.'" And so, this idea of hating our father and mother, wife and children, he's not talking about when we study that, we study the context and all of that. Actually what he's saying here is we love them less than we love God. If we're not willing to sacrifice that relationship over our service to God, then we are not fit to be called his disciples there. And so when we obey authority, including our parents, in a way that contradicts God's will, we show that we are putting their authority over the authority of God. And then vice versa, when we refuse to allow the authority to God to be undermined by an authority of man, then we are showing our love for God, that our love for God is stronger than our love for these people. And as we said a couple of times this morning, this includes parents, teachers, coaches, bosses, worldly authority, governors, police, anyone. But there's a lot to unpack there, and a lot of things to consider as we go through those intricacies of the relationships that we have with all of these people. Oftentimes it's not simple. It's not simple. It can get complicated, but we simply must be willing to follow God, do so with as much respect as possible towards those who have authority over us.
I think it's important to note extreme, but using the word hate.
Yeah.
The love of God as compared to the love of even a child or a spouse.
Yeah.
We love God to such an extent that in comparison, the word hate shows the vast difference.
Yeah.
Between the two.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Very good point. That we must see our love for God much greater. I mean, like you said, that comparison, that those words there do a really good job in pointing that out, the difference, or how much higher we should elevate our love for God over anything here on earth. Very good point. Any other comments?
Shane, along, while we're in verse 1, along the lines of the child obeying the parent, I'm sure many in here have seen it, where when a child is young in their formative years, they would prefer to come to services. Maybe their parent is a Christian and wavered.
Yeah.
Maybe their parents aren't Christians and have visited, and the child are motivated them to be in services, but the parents won't afford to.
Yeah.
I've struggled with that. I've always thought, what a disservice a parent is doing when the child is young and God's principles can be established in the heart, and the parent won't expose them to that.
Yeah.
I think it's a tragedy, and I think God has a way of maybe rectifying that, the parable of the sower, the good and honest heart. Another situation in those formative years, I know of a child that wanted to be baptized, and the parents forbade him. He's in the denomination now.
Yeah.
When his heart was tender, they were like, no, I think you need to wait. And they basically talked him out of it, and then he never obeyed. And in those formative years, the parent's responsibility is great, and so many parents abdicate. I mean, think of the Christians that their children don't come. That's an abdication.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and we see it. We've seen it. Those of us who are of any age have seen it in any congregation. And so it's a grave responsibility to be a parent. And this passage, oftentimes, we think about the children in this passage, but just the parents' responsibility to see that the children are doing these things is as I've gotten older, more of a responsibility than the children just obeying. So, I think this is kind of maybe more of an instruction towards parents to make sure that we get our children to obey us. So, we've talked about our attitudes toward our parents if they're trying to get us to do something against God's will. But, given normal conditions, as we kind of conclude this section, children must obey their parents in all things. And so, there's a lot of, especially as your child gets older, a lot of times children don't see the reason why a parent tells them to do something. And really there may be no wisdom behind that. It might just be because that's the way the parent likes it done. But, the passages that we have read says in all things. In all things. So whether that is maybe it's better to do it another way, but your parents want you to do it this way, then you've got to do it that way. If it's not a sin, then you've got to do it that way. And that's a struggle for children, especially as they get older, to accept that authority. But it prepares them to accept the authority of God when they don't really understand that as well. And even the government, I mean, there's a lot of regulations that we live under in this country that I think are foolish, but yet I have to submit to them in order to be pleasing to God. I did my taxes yesterday, and seeing all that money going to the government and thinking of how foolishly a lot of it is spent, it's a hard thing to do, to see that money funneled into that. But yet, I've got to submit to that authority. We're told to in scriptures. And so it prepares us for that. So in all things, unless it goes against God. And so that's a hard lesson for a lot of us to learn. But it's one that we must learn. Any comments along those lines?
John, what do you think, go back and look at Proverbs, talk about training up a child in the way he should go. How do we reason that out?
That's a good question. That's a good question, and one that I've thought on personally myself a lot. That's, of course, we know that Proverbs are what we call truisms, and and if we follow those guidelines, the majority of the time, those things will come about. But it's just our children are free agents, and they can make those choices, and so we can't control the minds of our children. We can guide them. The old adage, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And you can do everything you can to raise up your children in the proper way. And if you do that, the majority of the time, that's going to happen. But your child is a free moral agent. And so they have choices to make there as well. And so, that's a tough thing for those of us who have children who are not faithful to consider. And I know many, if you're in that situation like we are, you go back and you see a lot of things you could have done differently. And so it's a hard thing to live with. But we have to move on. We have to do the best we can from this point forward. So
that teaches a lot more than sometimes we think about. You train them to eat their vegetables, you train them to brush their teeth, you train them to read maybe, and later on they encourage them to read the Bible. And so there's a lot of little things that go into that they won't depart from later. They'll have these habits. So those things.
And so, a lot of times you'll see children that will come back later in life as they get older and more wise. And so, we always, those things are, it gives us comfort knowing. I mean, I know dealing with one of my children in particular, starting to try to talk to her. She's like, I know everything you're going to say because it's been drilled into me since I was a little girl. There's no sense in telling me because I've heard it all. I've heard it all my life. I know what you're going to say. And that's a hard thing to be told. She's like, you've drilled it into me, so you might as well just hush. And so where do you go from there? It's a tough place to be. And, and you think, well, what should I have done besides have it drilled into her? Where should you go? And so that's a tough question, really tough question.
Yeah, I think you touched on what someone touched on. It's a matter. I know where you're coming from, so I can address it.
Yeah.
I think it's a matter of free will.
Yeah.
We're not robots. We can choose. And that's a good thing because it's not Calvinism where God chooses certain ones and others he doesn't choose.
Yeah.
So it's free will. You may not make it. We all make mistakes.
Yeah.
You may not. And they're faithful children of mine that I make mistakes with. They're faithful now. Okay, they may not be faithful in the future, but they're faithful now. So I think the key here is free will. They make their decision. Now, perhaps they read wrong people, maybe they read some wrong material, they looked at some wrong sites. Who had any idea?
Yeah.
Maybe they were influenced influenced by those in higher education. I mean, who knows? But I think the key is it's free will. They made a choice. That doesn't put the blame, in my opinion, back on us unless we intentionally did so.
And I,
Teaching the truth and making mistakes is part of life, because we're gonna make mistakes. And you'll make mistakes until you're my age. If you live that long, I hope you do.
Yeah.
And longer. But it's a matter of free will. What we have to do is don't be discouraged. Keep teaching the same thing to your children, your grandchildren, and to other people's children, and everybody will hear you. Just teach the truth and let the power of God, the gospel, save those that will hear it.
yeah.
That's what saves the gospel. And the rest of it is individual free will.
And I agree with that wholly. And a couple of points, I mean, I'm glad you brought all that out. A couple of points I was thinking of as you were going through that. You were listing all those things, you know, education, influence of friends, and things like that. We must remember Satan's at work here. Satan's at work. He's a roaring lion, roaming the earth, seeking whom he may devour. So he's at work with all these other things, and these things are so prevalent, they're so easy. Our children are so easily indoctrinated, or the avenues where a child can be indoctrinated with these things. You know, it's easy for them to come in contact with those avenues. And so Satan's at work, and he's at work trying to pull everyone that he can away from us. And so, you know, that's you know, one thing we have to understand. We can't discount Satan and his wiles, because they're there. And the other,
Like you said, let's don't forget the power of the gospel.
yeah,
The seed is planted. Let's don't forget that.
yeah.
Always, as long as there's life, there's opportunity.
And that's true. And the other point I'd like to point out there too is what you said was just keep doing the same thing. You know, how often do we see parents, when their children start going astray, they start trying to rationalize that behavior, and then before long they're condoning that behavior. You know, they start changing because their children are going astray, and they don't want to admit their children are wrong. You know, I know of people all over who have started accepting homosexuality because their children have come out as homosexuals. And so what they thought was wrong before, now it's okay because their child is doing it. But the point that Gerald made is keep doing the same thing. No matter what, if it's what the gospel teaches, you keep doing the same thing. Because when you start, you giving in to what your children are doing is not going to help them. It's not going to help them. And so it's incumbent upon us to continue to teach the same things that we always have, if they're in accordance with God's will. Now, if we find they're not, then we need to change, of course. But just stay the course. You never know what's going to happen down the road. You just never know. I mean, one example would be my father-in-law, George. He lived with my mother-in-law for many years. I don't know how many years, decades. And then she finally obeyed the gospel.
Keep praying.
And keep praying. And so we never know what's going to happen in the future. And it could be something, it could be a catastrophe, it could be them hitting rock bottom. That could bring them back. And so keep praying and keep going. And so I knew we wouldn't get very far, and we didn't. All good comments. I'm glad we had this discussion. We'll discuss a little bit more. Like I said, I want to kind of change next week, Lord willing, and talk a good bit about the adult child and parent relationship. So if you kind of want to be thinking about those things, and I think verse 2 kind of enters into that a little bit more, and what it means to honor our fathers and mothers. And there is a certain amount of obedience, I believe, that goes along with that. But I believe verse 2 deals with that it encompasses a lot there, both in our youth and in our adulthood, and exactly what it means to honor our fathers and mothers. And so, Lord willing, we'll do a lot of talking about that next week. So I appreciate your attention. I appreciate all those who made comments. Thank you so much.